To me, when I look at diets and diet culture, it's really anything that tells you not to listen to your body, right? Any kind of restriction, anything that tells you when or what or how much you can eat, which sounds scary because people like to have rules, right? Like we like to know, when am I supposed to eat? How much am I supposed to eat? What am I supposed to eat? But that teaches us not to listen to our body.
I'm your host, Kim Hines, and welcome to the Emotional Eats podcast. I'm on a mission to show you that what you consume, not just the food, affects your entire life. Midlife is different. Let's dig into the real reasons why you eat when you're not hungry and why you're not feeling well. My guests and I are going to give you doable solutions and help you let go of perfectionism, food rules, and stress to make changes that will last a lifetime. If you're ready to ditch old school diet culture and nourish your entire life, this is the show for you. I loved this interview with my friend Andie. And if you've lost weight before only to gain it back again and have done some yo-yo dieting throughout the years, or maybe you just think about food all the time, you will really enjoy this episode. So welcome to episode 1 of the Emotional Eats podcast. I chat with Andie Grange, who is a registered dietitian and has been doing this for over 10 years. She shares her story, her struggles with her relationship with food, and how she overcame them, and also how she's helping women to heal their relationship with food, but also change their mindset and create healthy habits. Andie and I talk about what diet culture is and why we're so stuck in it. We also talk about how to unlearn it. Andie shares an eye-opening fact about one of the biggest predictors of weight gain. And we talk about the myths around intuitive eating and everything that it involves, because many people believe intuitive eating is about just eating anything you want, anytime you want. You can follow Andie at dietitian.andie, A-N-D-I-E, on Instagram. Enjoy the show and let me know what you think. Hi, Andie. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. You're not only my friend, but you're someone I really respect as a registered dietitian. And I would love it if you would share with everyone a little bit about your story, and not only kind of where you came from to get into being a registered dietitian, but also how that led you into coaching people in the intuitive eating space.
Yeah, so I have been a dietitian for about 10 years, and I actually was drawn into it, as I've found a lot of people are, because of my own disordered relationship with food. During college, I really struggled. I actually was diagnosed with anorexia and had a pretty serious eating disorder. And like a lot of people, like I said, decided, hey, I'll study nutrition because I was obsessed with food. Luckily, I was able to work with a therapist and a dietitian myself and overcome that. It took a long time and it took a lot of work, but I was able to get to a place where I now have a really good, healthy relationship with food and have for years. And as a dietitian, I worked in a hospital, worked in a clinical setting, and really enjoyed it, but was feeling kind of burnt out and just I'd always wanted to use my experience healing my relationship with food to be able to help other people do the same. And so little by little, I kind of started my own coaching business, and now I'm doing it full time. And I help other women, not necessarily with eating disorders, like on that level, but just people that struggle, because so many of us struggle with our relationship with food, constantly caught in the diet cycle and just, unhealthy body image and mindset around food. And so now I help women with my own experience and my education be able to get out of the diet cycle and into just a really healthy, happy place with food where they're, healthy and balanced, but not in that obsession and constant diet cycle.
That's great. And I am in the same place. We came to this, both of us, because of our disordered eating, but it's a great way that we can turn around and help other people because, from our conversations, I have also felt that I was obsessed. I was obsessed with food and I couldn't get out of that cycle, which leads me to, since we all in this space of trying to lose weight, which we know is so much more than just the food now. But you have a great phrase, and you always say, this is the biggest predictor of weight gain. And I'd love for you to talk about what it is and expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so people think it's so crazy when they find out that dieting itself is actually the biggest predictor, the number one predictor of future weight gain. And that's not something that I've like made up or decided. I've seen it obviously a lot through my work, but UCLA actually did a meta-analysis where they looked at 31 different studies and found that dieting was the common denominator in people gaining weight. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, you think of dieting and you think of weight loss, but how often in your own experience or other people's experiences do you see people lose weight and then gain and lose and gain? And eventually they usually end up gaining more weight than they've ever lost. And so that's where they found that when people are constantly on these different diets or the same diet over and over, almost everybody ends up weighing more than they did at the beginning because of what it does to our body, to our mind, everything.
That is so true. And I always say to clients, if you've been on 5 diets, at least 4 of them have failed. And they
Yeah.
haven't really failed. The diet itself has failed. You haven't failed. And I know that you are really strong when you talk to people about it. It's a diet culture. So to you, what is diet culture?
Yeah. So to me, when I look at diets and diet culture, it's really anything that tells you not to listen to your body, right? Any kind of restriction, anything that tells you when or what or how much you can eat, which sounds scary because people like to have rules, right? Like we like to know, when am I supposed to eat? How much am I supposed to eat? What am I supposed to eat? But that teaches us not to listen to our body. So anything diet culture, I mean, sometimes people will tell me, oh, well, I'm doing like macro counting. That's food freedom. I did macros, and that was definitely not food freedom because it told me how much I could eat. I was having to track everything I ate. So anything that encourages that tracking, constant just thinking about food and really like limiting whether it's how much or what you can eat is getting stuck in that diet cycle. And again, I will get into this, I'm sure. It doesn't mean like just eat cake and pizza all day, right? Sometimes people think that's what intuitive eating is. It's very much a balanced, nutritious approach, but it's really focusing on it from a healthy mindset.
That's great. I think diet culture also, unfortunately, is telling the world what bodies should look like. It's not just the food, but we, as people who are obsessed with diets, we bring it all down just to food. So I'm glad that you brought that up. But let's go into intuitive eating because you are an amazing intuitive eating coach. And I'd love for you to explain a little bit more about the intuitive eating framework, because the myths are out there that people think, oh, if I just want, a donut, I can eat 10 and everything's going to be fine. Can you explain a little bit more about that framework?
Yeah, so it really starts with kind of breaking those food rules. And those are usually things that we've learned from dieting or diet culture. So, just to give a few examples, maybe like, oh, I can't eat anything after 7, or I can only have 1 piece of bread a day, or, any kind of random diet food rule that we've come up with. So we start to break those. And again, that can feel scary at first because we kind of think of those as like our safety net, right? That's what's going to keep us in control. But how often do you go out of your diet just a little bit and then feel totally out of control, like, oh, I'll just have 1 slice of pizza, and then you eat the whole thing? So it's starting to break those rules. And at first, honestly, people can find that they're kind of overeating a little bit, or maybe they have a lot of cravings for sweets because all of a sudden you're finally letting yourself have that. But if you stick with it, eventually that goes away. Like, I actually was just recording a reel earlier today about how I have so many foods in my house that I used to be totally out of control around. Mike and Ike's, red vines. I love like candy and sweets. They're not even open. They've been in my house for like a month because I just don't have that desire to eat them anymore because I know I can have them whenever I want. So it's really about changing your mindset, which then helps you change your habits. And I crave veggie. I have my clients all the time telling me like, I'm craving veggies. That's never happened to me before. But it's because before they thought that they had to eat veggies and they couldn't eat treats, right? So we're changing our mindset, which then changes our habits naturally, because our bodies are so good at really having that balance if we let them and actually let go of control.
That's part of it, I really believe, is being able to slow down and listen to our bodies. I love how you mentioned having the candy in the house, because we have these forbidden foods that we're afraid to have because we will be out of control. And I love how you have that conversation, the conversation with yourself, even. I can eat this food anytime. There's no urgency, there's no emergency. I can eat it now. I can eat it in 20 minutes. I can eat it tomorrow. And with that freedom, that's where the freedom is. It's not in whether the food's there or not and you're going to eat all of it. It's just telling yourself, okay, you get to choose that. It's not out of your control. And I love that you said that. So when we are talking about intuitive eating, tell me about some of the things that people thought about intuitive eating that are not true when they come to you.
Yeah, such a good question. And I have conversations about this probably every day on Instagram. But a few of the things, one, like I mentioned, is people think it's just eating whatever you want, whenever you want, with no regard for nutrition. A whole section of my program and of the intuitive eating framework is gentle nutrition, right? So we're very much focused on nutrition and fueling our bodies, but not in a restrictive way. Another thing that people think is that it's anti-weight loss, or that they will for sure gain weight on it. It's anti-focusing on weight loss, but I have people in my program all the time that lose weight, right? Some do, some don't. It's definitely not anti-weight loss. It's just taking that focus off of weight loss and putting it onto the habits and the mindset, and then trusting your body to do the rest. So I think those are two of the biggest ones I see, that people think is just eating anything all the time, and also that it means you're going to gain weight. And neither of those are necessarily true.
So with that, so let's say you have someone who is a big emotional eater, big binge eater, and that's where I came from. I came from a very binge restrict cycle. How do you help people? What are some of the steps that you can take them through to help them with that?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, first thing is we start breaking those food rules and really starting to focus on the mindfulness behind it. So, I have several frameworks that have them work through, modules in my program that they'll work through to really start taking the focus back to the why behind their eating. Not what are you eating, but why are you eating it? And I actually will have them fill out, the only kind of tracking we do in my program is really thinking about, how do you feel before you eat? How do you feel during what you're eating? And how are you feeling after? What's your hunger level, your fullness level? Where's your mindset? And really tracking, and people start to realize, like, oh, maybe I was just eating because I was stressed, or maybe I did overeat because of X, Y, and Z. There's also like an emotional eating guide that I have them use, where I'll have them put it on their fridge. And when they go to eat, if they are eating because of an emotional reason, I'm like, okay, wait, stop, and take 10 deep breaths, dance it out, walk around the block, then come back. And if you still want to eat, you can. But maybe you realize that it was just stress and you actually feel okay and you don't want to eat now. Or if you do want to eat, you're in a much better mindset now to be able to eat that thing mindfully, not overeat, not binge. So once we get out of that, once we get mindful, and B, once we get out of that restriction phase, the restriction was what causes the binging, right? So once we let go of that restriction, we find that eventually we no longer have that desire to binge because there's no need to.
I feel like our brains are automatically like naughty 5-year-olds. When we are told that we cannot have something, we can't stop thinking about it. And we've been really for years. And those of you who you can't see us because you're on a podcast, but Andie's younger than I am, and we're still dealing with the exact same issues here. And in the 80s, a lot of this started with Slim Fast and constantly doing aerobics and diet sodas, Tab and RC. And then we moved into the fat-free phase. Diet culture has been with us for so long, and the rules that have come out. And imagine now, too, what people are facing every time we learn something. The egg is good, the egg is bad, everything that we go through. So how do we unlearn? What are some things that we can maybe do mentally to unlearn this behavior so that we can rewire this brain, this activity on diet culture?
Yeah, it can be really hard, but I think one of the things that I found most helpful is to make sure, because so much of what we get, so much of the information that we get is from social media, right? Like that's just a huge part of our world now. So I think really curating your social media feed to make sure you're following the right people. If you're following people that make you feel terrible about your body and about your diet, that's probably not serving you. It's probably not a person that you should follow. Really follow accounts that have good, legitimate nutrition information. Do your research, ask people with credentialing, whether it's a doctor, a dietitian, a nutritionist that's certified. Make sure that you're not, just because somebody has a quote unquote fit body. We see all these influencers that have absolutely no nutrition or medical training giving macros and giving diet plans and all of these things. And they may have no idea what they're doing, right? And so making sure that you're getting the information from the right people, and also that you're really following people on social media that are promoting good, healthy balance. And I always say, like, if it cuts out an entire food or food group, unless it's like an allergy or something like that, of course, but if it cuts out an entire food or food group, it's probably not a good balanced approach, because anything can fit in the right circumstances.
And that makes me think about bioindividuality too. When you're working with your clients and they're going through your program, do you help them kind of see that their body is their own, and so their preferences and everything may not fit into a diet structure?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one thing that's so crazy to people to find out is, sometimes we even think, like, I enjoy some foods that I used to eat when I was a dieter. And sometimes we think, well, if I'm meal prepping or if I'm eating a protein bar, does that mean I'm still dieting? No, if I actually enjoy that, that's okay. So it's really getting to the root of, yeah, what are your preferences? What do you like? What satisfies you? What doesn't? And making sure that it fits for you. And that's the thing that's so great about intuitive eating, is it really can fit into your lifestyle. And even if you do have restrictions, right? I've worked with people in my program that have celiac disease, that have to avoid gluten, or that have PCOS, or that have diabetes, that have certain, medical dietary restrictions or limitations. And you can still work with intuitive eating. You might have to practice a little more gentle nutrition. You might have to, make a few changes, but it's still about listening to your body and what makes you feel good. If you're celiac and you're eating gluten, you're not going to feel good, right? So it comes back to, like, how are you feeling, and really taking the focus off of weight and numbers and diets, but just focusing on mindfulness and how your body feels.
I really appreciate you bringing up social media, because we're in a land of watching things and believing them to be true. And just because it's out there, just because somebody posts it, instead of doing our own work in the background. I'd also love to hear how you feel the dieting and how this all affects things like hormones and blood sugar, because you bring up a lot of good points about the stress of dieting, but it affects so many other things that we don't even realize, which make it even harder to stay on track when you're dieting.
That is such a good point. So, yeah, I mean, so many diets really negatively affect our hormones, especially our hunger and fullness hormones, right? We found that dieting actually decreases our leptin levels, which is our fullness hormone. So no wonder we feel hungry all the time when we're on a diet. Our body is meant to and made to help us survive, right? So if we're limiting our food intake, our body is going to fight that by being like, wait, I need more food. So it's going to decrease our metabolism. It's going to mess with our hormones to be like, no, you need to eat. And the other thing too, diets like intermittent fasting and things like that, there's a lot of research behind them to show that, especially for women, because our hormones are just so much more complex, I feel like, in a lot of ways, it has a lot of negative effects on hormones. And the other big thing that I've found is GI symptoms. We know that stress and the gut are so related. I always use the example of, think about when you're nervous and you get like butterflies in your stomach, right? Like you have that almost like nauseous or GI reaction, because our GI systems and stress system are so related that a lot of times people find, and there are definitely legitimate intolerances, right? Like that's a real thing. But I have found with a lot of my clients that sometimes they find some of their intolerances are actually more related to their stress and anxiety and guilt around food than an actual intolerance. And once they're healing their relationship and their mindset with food, they're actually able to tolerate a lot of foods that they couldn't before because they have a lot more balanced approach to it.
Yes. And you just brought up the guilt. I think the shame and the guilt that comes along with food is really sad because we are doing this to ourselves. We're just eating food, we're just enjoying food. Or sometimes we're not enjoying it because we are mindlessly eating it. We have that emotional attachment, like you mentioned. What are we really hungry for? It may not be the food, but after the fact, sadly, we have an emotional response to having the guilt, the shame, the overeating. How do you help your clients through that horrible feeling afterwards so that they don't just keep repeating the cycle over and over again?
Yeah, so we do talk a lot about just having grace for yourself and having patience, because I always remind my clients when they feel like they're not making the progress that they want to quickly enough. Like, think of how long it took you to get to where you're at. Maybe you've been dieting for 30, 40, 50 years. It's not going to be fixed overnight. So, realizing that it's those little things, those little steps, those little wins that add up and add up and add up. And then, a month or 5 or 6 or 10 months down the road, they look back and realize how far they've come. And so I think, if they do message me, I've had clients message me and be like, man, I'm just really struggling this week. I overate, or I binged, or I'm feeling terrible about my body. And I'm like, okay, let's take it back. What are the wins that you've had? What are the small things you can do this week to feel better? Like, whatever happened, happened. And that's another thing is, I think I always tell them to reframe. It wasn't a failure, it was a learning experience. Like, if something happened, if you did binge on pizza last Friday, why did it happen? Let's focus on like what we can do next time to change that. And instead of looking at it as a failure, let's look at it as a learning opportunity to hopefully do better next time.
That is so great. A learning opportunity instead of beating themselves up, really almost like being an observer, trying
Yeah.
to be observing and curious about what happened and why they went there. That's great. How does exercise and movement play into this intuitive eating framework?
Yeah. So going back to how we feel, right? We know that if we're doing intuitive movement, I like to call it, we're going to feel better. Really, exercise can be used as a stress reliever, and we know it is healthy for our bodies. It's great to get in movement. But if you're forcing yourself to do something you hate, then it's probably not going to be something you're going to stick with, right? If you hate running and you're trying to run every day, it probably won't last very long. But maybe you find that you really love kickboxing classes at your local gym, right? So I always encourage people to try out different forms of movement. Don't feel like you have to do, what you see on social media or what you see X, Y, and Z person doing. Try out different things, see what works for you, get variety. I think, if you're at a point where you look forward to your movement, that can actually happen. Maybe you realize it's like taking a tango class, or, going swimming or whatever. It can be different things. And the other thing too, I think people don't realize, is you can be really active in your everyday life. Exercise can look different than like hitting the gym and lifting weights. Maybe it's, chasing around your grandkids. Maybe it's gardening. Maybe, there are a lot of ways that we can be active that don't necessarily look like what we typically think of as exercise.
I think that is really great advice because we all have different preferences. And like you said, we see things online that, it looks effective because, of course, the influencer has the body that matches what society says is a good body. So then we think that's what we should be doing. And I laugh because I just had a conversation today with someone, and I always wanted to be that yoga Pilates girl, but that's just not me. I'm the runner lifter girl. And we were laughing about it because she was the opposite. And the important thing is exactly what you said. What are you going to do that you look forward to and you want to do every day, even if it's walking, because walking is such a beneficial movement for everyone. But thank you. That was a great way to share again that bio individuality. So I'm curious too, how do you see nutrition and dietetics evolving with this? Because it seems like there are more and more dietitians that are talking more this way and not quite so absolute with the food. Do you see that evolving in your field?
I definitely do. And it's something that I'm so happy about. I know, I mean, I went to school I don't even know what, over 10 years ago now, I guess 12 years ago. And we didn't learn anything about intuitive eating. Everything that I learned was from my own experience and my own study and, doing all my own research. Unfortunately, we were really kind of taught more of a diet mindset and restriction and counting calories. And I think I've heard from some current dietetic students that and nutrition students that that is changing and that they're now starting to learn a little bit more about intuitive eating, which I think is great. But I do think, like I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of us were drawn into that field because of our own disordered eating. And I think luckily a lot of us have gotten the help that we needed. And now we realize how harmful that is. And so we're trying to help, the next generation or even just the people that grew up in the same generation as us that are struggling to overcome that. And I hope little by little we can get to a place where, down the road, people aren't struggling as much because like you said, growing up in the 80s, and I mean, I grew up in the 80s and I think my generation too, our moms were the ones who grew up with Slim Fast and Weight Watchers and all of that. And so that's what we saw
Yeah.
and that's what we repeated. So I'm hoping that that's changing and we're going to get more and more progress in that direction.
That is really important. And I love how that is evolving for all of you. And I have a question about cravings because we have cravings and it could be sweet cravings. Some people have the salty. We have all these different cravings and they come for different reasons. What are your thoughts on giving into those cravings versus, all the little tricks that people tried to teach us to curb the cravings? Drink water and you won't be hungry. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, two things. The first one is I always talk to my clients about physical versus emotional hunger, right? Like, are you physically hungry or are you emotionally hungry? That kind of goes back to the emotional eating. Usually there's a lot of big differences there. With emotional hunger, there's usually a craving for like a specific food, like chocolate or ice cream, and it's usually very urgent, whereas physical hunger is more, I could eat a variety of things and be satisfied, and it's a little bit slower. But also, I talk a lot about satiety versus fullness, and there's a big difference there. And I think that's where cravings kind of come in. If you're really craving bread, I love bread, so I'll use that as an example. If you're really craving bread and maybe you want a sandwich for lunch, but you're like, oh, I had, bread for breakfast, or I'm going to have bread at dinner. I'm not allowed to eat that much bread. So you have a salad. You're likely going to feel unsatisfied and be like, why do I still feel hungry? Even though technically you're full, but you feel this unsatisfied feeling. So maybe instead I have a sandwich with some vegetables on it, or I have, a salad with a side of bread. Like you can work in nutrition and your cravings at the same time. And when you actually listen to what your body's craving, you're much less likely to keep feeling hungry and much less likely to overeat. I always use the example of like, if you want a cookie and you're like, okay, well, I'll just eat some carrots and hummus because that's healthier. And then you're still hungry. So you're like, okay, well, I'll have like a cookie dough protein bar, and you're still hungry. So then you eat a cookie and then you eat 10 cookies. Whereas if you just eaten the cookie in the first place, you could have been satisfied and avoided that whole process.
And it's great to be able to live life. I find the intuitive eating framework, it incorporates everything that we need. It's not just about food, it's the stress and the coping skills. And that's one of the things I'd love to talk to you about too. Do you help your clients deal with some of the things that may cause them to stress and emotionally eat, like bring down the stress or make them feel like they can get into a more mindful place? Do you have some coping mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a huge part of my program actually, is really talking about how stress and all those other things affect our eating and our health and our weight. So we have a whole section on stress management and self-care and really making sure that you're taking time to take care of yourself, because if you're not, you're likely going to use food as a coping mechanism. And like I mentioned, the emotional eating guide that I have has sections where you can write out different things that help you relieve stress other than food. Is it calling your mom or your sister? Is it going for a walk? Is it playing with your dog? What else helps you relieve stress? And so you're not using food as your only coping mechanism. And then focusing on things like sleep that so many of us think isn't important, but really affects our health and again, our weight and all of that so much. And so we really focus a lot on other things other than just food and exercise.
You hit on two of my favorite things: self-care, because we are in such a busy society. We are hustle, go, go, go. And when we don't take time to take care of ourselves. And self-care doesn't have to be the massages and bubble baths. It can literally just be some alone time or getting off the phone, which, as you and I've talked about, that might be a good idea anyway, so that we're not doing the scrolling and comparisonitis. The other thing is, plus, we eat on our phones sometimes, and that is mindless also. But sleep is so important. You talked about those hormones, and we cannot optimize those hormones. We can't make good decisions for ourselves. And I'm not saying make good decisions with food, because we have just talked about what intuitive eating is, but make good decisions on how you feel if you haven't had a decent night's sleep.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing that up. Those are two really wonderful things that we need to take a look at. And I love how you've really wrapped all of this up. It's like a big package. Intuitive eating is not just about the food. And I do want to remind our listeners that if you do have any thought in your head that you might have an eating disorder, please make sure you reach out and get some help for that. Find a medical professional or find a mental health professional and make sure you get some help with that, because we both know how difficult that is. You cannot do this on your own. And I think that would be one of the most important things for you to start with if that's where you are. And I always ask my podcast guests, when we are trying to nourish our whole lives, which is pretty much what intuitive eating is about. Let's say we have someone who's brand new to this. They're not really sure where to start. They haven't reached out to anyone yet, but they're understanding that dieting's not working for them. What are 3 things that you think that they could start with that would be doable, and maybe those baby steps you were talking about?
Yeah. So again, I'll go back to social media. I think one of the biggest ones is really curating your social media feed. Follow some intuitive eating dietitians to learn more about it, right? Maybe unfollow the diety accounts that aren't serving you anymore. So I think that's a big one. And then one thing that is kind of random, but I have found so much helps me just to be mindful and just feel better, is creating a morning and a nighttime routine. That's not something I ever prioritized in the past. And that's a big part of my life now. And it has made me so much mentally and physically, I just feel so much better. So whatever it is that works for you, right? But like getting off your phone, like we talked about, and just really focusing on taking care of yourself. For me in the morning, it's exercise and it's reading and it's doing some things that just get me in a good mood and mindset for the day. So I think creating that nighttime and morning routine. And then the last one I think is, kind of journaling, and it can be in whatever way works for you. Because I'm not a big journaler usually, but really just starting to write down, like I've started writing down 3 things I'm grateful for every morning as part of my morning routine. And, doing things like that, or whether it's maybe journaling kind of your thoughts around food or your body image, I think getting that down on paper can help you start to process and really recognize and realize what's going on for you. So I think those are 3 of the biggest things that, again, we kind of talked about this before the podcast, don't necessarily have to do with food specifically, but can make such a big difference in your health journey and your nutrition and intuitive eating journey.
And I'm going to add a 4th one. Make sure you are following Andie. So Andie, where can we find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at dietitian.andie, Andie. That's where I'm at for the most part. I also have a Facebook page, and I'm on TikTok as well, but Instagram's kind of my main hub. So.
And what do you have going on right now that people might be interested in, like programs?
Yeah, so I do have a healthy habits coaching program, which is where I walk people through the whole intuitive eating, process, and really healing their relationship with food, getting to a good, healthy place. There's a lot of coaching and one-on-one support and group support involved. So that's probably the best place. And I'm always happy to talk to people about that. There's also a program video at the link in my bio on Instagram that you can watch that talks more about my program.
Thank you, Andie. I really appreciate you being here. And you did a great job of explaining intuitive eating. And I think it's going to really help a lot of women.
Thank you. I think it's so important to have these conversations. So I really appreciate you having me on today.
Make sure to remember to nourish your entire life and give yourself grace today. I really appreciate you being here. If you resonated with this podcast, It would mean a lot to me if you'd be willing to follow or subscribe to the Emotional Eats podcast. Then you'll never miss an episode. Just go to the Emotional Eats show page on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and tap the plus sign in the upper right-hand corner and click on it. While you're there, if you'd be willing to give me a 5-star rating and review, I would be so grateful. If you'd like to take a screenshot and share it on Instagram, just tag me at Kim Hines Health. I would love to hear your thoughts and let me know how I can support you. You can always DM me on Instagram, again, at Kim Hines Health. And just remember to nourish your life and give yourself grace today.